All right, next, Athens. And here's where we're going to find our center of gravity tonight, because we noticed last time some of Paul's preaching to the Jews, and we'll brush through that tonight as a comparison point. But I want us to sit with the way he translates it. It's why I started with the wedding chapel, the drive-through wedding chapel. Paul wasn't a guy who did drive-through weddings. In Athens, he spoke a different rendition, not a different content, but a different entry point to his audience, because he was speaking to Gentiles. He was speaking to people who were in the philosophical capital of the ancient world. And so he spent the effort in Luke's rendering of this. He spent the effort to know them, and in kind of as a part of knowing them, to understand what might connect between the gospel and themselves, their culture and the gospel of Jesus. Right? And so here's how it goes. While Paul was waiting for Paul and Silas, or for Silas and Timothy, sorry, that's a misprint, in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Now, he's been in a lot of cities that have a lot of idols, but this is Athens. And we know from Paul's letters that he was philosophically inclined. Sometimes he looks downright stoic, and you can compare him to Seneca in some of the things he says, or Epictetus in others of the things he says. Both of them were famous first century Stoicism, teachers of Stoicism, right? So we know Paul cared about the world of popular philosophy and the kind of people that would have been hanging out in Athens doing that, right? We know that he cared about it, and we could see why, even having been to Philippi, where there, I don't know if you've ever been to this part of the world, but they have unearthed pagan temples in Philippi and Thessalonica and all these cities that we're passing through right now. So he was disappointed. So he went to the synagogue, interestingly. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well in the marketplace day by day with anybody who happened to be there. So he's biding his time, waiting for Paul and Timothy, and he looks around and he sees all these idol temples, and he feels grieved by them. He feels grieved not because they're competitors in religion, but because he cares about the people who are going to them. And you can see some of the people in this rendering of the ancient temple in Athens. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with Paul. Now, in this time, Stoicism was by far the most popular philosophy of the day. Romans loved Stoicism. You know the word because it's used more broadly than philosophy. A Stoic person is one who weathers the storm without getting all emotional, without a whole lot of complaint. There's a standing up and continuing in the face of hardship in Stoicism. Epicureans were among the only atheists in the ancient world. They didn't believe in the temples. They didn't believe in the gods or the superstitions. They, of course, didn't believe in an afterlife. And so Epicureans and Stoics were different from one another, but they would have been a cut above, or maybe more on the level Paul was thinking Athens would be, than the common folks who were going to the temples and trading sacrifices for good travel or something, right? So they go and grab him, and some of them ask, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So Paul in Athens is, when he's talking to these people in the street, or the philosophers, or the Jews in the synagogue, he's sharing about Jesus's resurrection, and they are curious about it, it seems. Now, as we go toward the speech, I gave you this rather difficult article for those who wanted to go long in your preparation. I gave you this Patrick Gray article about implied audiences in chapter 17. You're not going to get a lot of that tonight. It's a really, I think, interesting and helpful article, but a lot of you didn't read it because it's a little forbidding. It's academies and all kinds of things like that. So I thought I'd give you this by way of telling you a lot of people have done a lot of things in trying to interpret the passage we're in tonight. Paul's address before the Areopagus, and this is a quote from that article, in Acts 17 counts as one of the most celebrated passages in the New Testament. It has been read variously as, one, an expression of natural theology. That is, that we can learn everything we know about, need to know about God from nature, from creation. An expression of natural theology rooted in Stoic thought. So Paul's borrowing from Stoics, say some people. A Christian sermon aimed at Gentiles, yet steeped in biblical language and thought patterns. Three, a gauge of Luke's reliability as a historian. So people go in here and ask, did Paul really say these things? Is this the way it would have gone in ancient Athens? Does it seem realistic? Four, a source of reconstructing Paul's missionary modus operandi, his usual way of doing mission. Five, evidence for or against Pauline authorship vis-a-vis the epistles, right? That is, does this sound like the Paul who wrote the epistles? And this sampling is by no means exhaustive. So people have scrambled toward Acts 17 for a lot of reasons and with a lot of questions, and you probably have your set. This is a good time, by the way, to remind you that Kelly, our illustrious host, is always aching for more questions. If you've got questions, put them in the chat, and we will answer. We'll get to Q&A in about 10 minutes here, right? So put your questions in the chat, and a lot of people have asked a lot of questions about Acts 17. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus. Now, Areopagus means Mars Hill. You may have heard of churches called Mars Hill Church. There's one in Seattle that became famous. There's one in Michigan, Grand Rapids, that happened to be Rob Bell's church. Areopagus is the Greek word that comes out Mars Hill, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting?" So they're being curious about this resurrection thing. "You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." Parenthetically, by Luke's narrator, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas, right? So they like novelties, and it's starting to get to be a portrayal of shallowness in a way, right? Whatever's new, we want to listen to it. So let's see how Paul answers them. Pardon me for a second. Paul then stood up in this meeting of the Areopagus, and there's the rock itself, right? That's the rock on which Paul is sort of remembered to have spoken. And I say in my handout, the prep guide this week, I actually recited Acts 17's speech from that rock, and when I was leading a trip once, and we had 33 people, but a whole lot of people gathered because everybody who's touring off Athens apparently also likes whatever is new, and they liked a strange-looking pastor in a baseball cap speaking Acts 17. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said this: "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious." Notice that his next words are not, "Shame on you for that." Right? His next words are not, "You Athenians have gone absolutely the wrong way." Instead, he says, "For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription: to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." In other words, you don't know what you're worshiping, but I can hear your longing, right? I can feel your longing for the God who might actually be knowable. The God who made the world and everything in it. Now, let's remember that the pagan gods that he has seen worshipped in town would have been a god of the sea, a god of the sky, a, a god of the crops. Each of the parts of creation would have been uh, mastered or controlled by one of the gods. So Paul is asserting one God did all of this. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man, he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. Though he is not far from any of us, for let's see if I can move something on my screen. And for in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said. We are his offspring. And these are references, these are quotes of Greek poets. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we shouldn't think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, for he has set a day when he'll judge the world with justice by the man he's appointed. That's Jesus. He's given proof of this to everyone by raising this Jesus from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people he became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius on your right, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. So here ends the episode of the speech, the episode of Paul's rhetorical bit spoken on Mars Hill with Epicureans and Stoics and others gathered around because they were curious. Let's talk for a bit about it. And to do that, I'm going to leave the share. So I mentioned and have led up to this in the things we've done already by the fact that Paul does his homework. He has time on his hands. And instead of going to the casino or seeing which restaurant is best in town, he's been doing what do these people most value, and he finds that they've got all kinds of gods, and he had an idealistic picture of Athens and it doesn't match up. But instead of lambasting them, he makes that a part of how he understands them. It's a human tendency to seek and long for God, he says. And God has made us that way. Augustine said, our hearts are restless, Lord, until they rest in thee, right? God has made us that way, hungry for God, but you're expressing or you're feeding yourselves in lesser ways than God. God's not made of gold or silver or wood. God is the creator of everything, including us. And so search for him because he's demonstrated his rightness or his worth by giving his son Jesus, who rose from the dead. Right? That's a tailored message that capitalizes or builds on a thing about them that Paul has observed and speaks as much as he can in their language, even quoting their own poets to sort of show his understanding of the way they think about the world. You should listen to your own poets, right? So Paul, as he and I do this partly because the Athens chapter is just so famous and central to some people's way of reading Acts, but the rest is in our own lives, in the way that we do the world. It's not a bad idea to at least try on the sort of empathy that lies behind Paul's attempt to get these people, to get them, to know them, to understand them, and to build on that, rather than simply dismiss them because they haven't got this God thing down yet, right? There's an empathy that motivates Paul and makes his message more powerful. And some actually believe. Others just keep going for another new thing. Right? It's not utterly successful in Athens. They can name it a couple, and there are others who join him. But his way of addressing them captured hearts and at least made them want to know more. All right.